Agriculture is the second largest contributor to Colorado's economy, and the state's agricultural history illustrates tenacity and resilience despite disastrous growing seasons and economic hardship. Hi, I'm John Ferrugia. Through its Centennial Farms program, History Colorado recognizes farms and ranches owned and operated by the same family for over 100 years. Now, this honor is bestowed annually at the Colorado State Fair. Today, Colorado boasts over 500 Centennial farms and ranches throughout the state. In this episode of Colorado Experience, you will meet 4th, 5th, and 6th generation farmers who are continuing to work the land once planted by their ancestors over 100 years ago. And now, Colorado Experience, Centennial Farms.
The history of Colorado and the history of agriculture do go hand in hand. People have been farming in Colorado for hundreds, if not thousands, of years.
Ranching has to be in your blood. Farming has to be in your blood.
Centennial Farm is a designation of the family working that same land, that same area for 100 years.
It shows the progression of agriculture from the early 1800s to the present.
When we lose contact with our origins and our origins become an abstraction, we have been mentally damaged.
It's not an easy life, but it's extremely rewarding.
This program was funded by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, with additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And viewers like you, thank you.
The history of agriculture in Colorado is older than the state itself. Colorado's first farmers tilled the earth more than 1,500 years ago, when the ancestral Pueblo people first planted maize, beans, and squash atop the mesas of southwestern Colorado. The Utes, the original Coloradans, diverted streams to create fields, allowing crops to grow in the Great American Desert. As Hispano settlers arrived in Colorado, boundaries changed. Mexican officials issued land grants in the 1830s and 40s, encouraging settlement in this part of the country.
The San Luis Valley was Indian country back in the 1800s. A number of Hispanic colonists from New Mexico had come up and tried to stay here, but the Ute Indians basically kept them out.
You're moving your family into a place that might be precarious. Having that made possible by an official government land grant, that's a really important part of the dynamic.
These are farming communities with irrigation ditches that predate the Pikes Peak Gold Rush and represent some of the oldest continuous farming in Colorado.
Those are not always the calmest areas to move into.
My great-grandpa, Felipe. Indians capture him.
He was herding the family sheep in Mexico, and he was captured by the Apaches.
So that he couldn't get away, they took hot irons and they burnt the back of his knees.
He tried to run away with a companion and made it to the Rio Grande, but in those days the Rio Grande had a lot of water, and they were trying to find a place to cross. When the Indians recaptured them, they had plans to have my grandfather marry an Indian girl, so they didn't kill him. They tied his companion to a tree and lanced him to death as a lesson to my great-grandfather that he should not try to run away again.
After they got whatever they wanted to get out of him for so many years, they sold him as a slave.
Our ancestors came from northern New Mexico into the valley sometime in the 1850s. We do know that the Salazar Ditch, which is one of the oldest ditches priorities in the San Luis Valley, has an 1856 priority date. Francisco Esteban came to the valley because things were getting crowded in northern New Mexico. The farms were small, it was hard to make a living on the farm. And when they saw the opportunity to come into the valley and farm, they came. And so they came with their cattle and their sheep. They did not have a lot of money, so the original homestead tract here, they only had 14 acres, and then they expanded it.
My great something, Grandpa Eusebio, he was only 17 at the time, and to go work in the mines, you had to be 18 legally. And he signed his age a little older than he was, and he went off and worked in the mines and got enough money to buy a 40-acre piece of land that we still have in the property, and he was able to give it to his family.
The San Luis Valley is a large, high mountain valley in the south-central part of Colorado. It's a glacial valley. The glaciers left behind a very fertile layer of soil in the valley, which is underpinned by enormous aquifers. And so the San Luis Valley, although it has a relatively short growing season, is a wonderful place to grow potatoes and beans and squash and barley.
Well, this is probably the most beautiful place on earth. This is Los Rincones, Colorado. We were all born and raised on this ranch. As a matter of fact, my dad and mom raised 8 children right here on 52 acres of land.
In the early days, there was a flour mill right close to here. And so people raised their own wheat, took it to the mill, had it milled. My father, when I was a young child, used to take potatoes from our farm into northern New Mexico and exchange them for apples, chili, for the different kinds of fruits that are grown in northern New Mexico.
When we were 5 years old, we were actually loading bales of hay and hauling them and putting them away in storage. We learned to ride horses since we were little kids. We learned to drive tractors since we were little kids.
As a little boy, my dad would take us on cattle drives. My father and grandfather had a ranch, but it was a small ranch. And so they would get together with the other relatives, and they would take cattle up to the mountains together.
We found our inspiration in working along the field with my mom and dad, just trying to make sure that we fed the family.
I remember my mother clearly going out and butchering a chicken because, we didn't have grocery stores nearby, and that's what we would have for lunch or dinner.
We canned fruits and vegetables, we froze them. Everything was homemade.
When we got older, my father expanded the farm. Then we were needed to run the tractors.
The first tractor that we got was in 1956. So before that, it was horse-drawn equipment. That's one of the reasons the farms are small. Back in about 1951, my father saw that the farm was too small really to support a family. And so he bought the first piece of land in 1951. And then in 1969, he again saw the need to expand, and so he bought another quarter section and then did the same thing in about 1975. We've had to keep pace.
I used to love to get up in the morning, and I'd look forward to going and sitting on a tractor for 12 hours. And I really appreciate the fact that my brothers and my dad encouraged us, even though we were women, to go out and run all the farm equipment.
Here it was up early, milking the cows at 5 o'clock in the morning. Then in the evening, it was study hall. My father made sure that we worked really hard in school because he always said the gateway to opportunity is education.
In 1859, the San Luis Valley experienced an increase in demand due to a little something called the Colorado Gold Rush, which spearheaded a mass influx of prospectors looking to get rich and get out. During this time, the demand for food in the Rocky Mountains exceeded the supply, and boosters took to the streets, encouraging those on the East Coast and the Midwest to head for this unknown territory.
When you have a bunch of people who were drawn to an area because of the hope of mineral riches, you have some hungry people.
Everything you eat is out of cans or it's dried. You're bringing flour and salt and sugar with you and coffee, but fresh produce is almost impossible to come by. Fresh meat initially in Colorado was very difficult unless you went up to the mountains and hunted game.
So it is expensive and draining to bring in food imported from the Missouri River country. No, that's not going to work. So it is just an open door of opportunity for farmers.
The first thing that boosters had to do was overturn the popular idea that Colorado was the great American desert. This was a label that had been applied by explorers such as Zebulon Pike and Stephen Long, who had said
it's too dry here for you to come practice agriculture.
That agricultural settlement would never stick in Colorado.
The booster is an extremely important figure in Western American history. They were romanticizers of the West and its opportunity.
People like William Byers began writing about Colorado as the new Garden of Eden, a place where you could grow virtually any crop that you wanted to. And in theory, he was right. The soil in Colorado is extremely rich. The problem, of course, is finding the water.
Our great-great-grandfather, George B., brought his family from England in 1853, and they settled in Upper Sandusky, Ohio. He had 5 brother-in-laws that settled in Iowa. His son, John, when he was 16, he went to Iowa and met his wife there and had 4 children, but he suffered from asthma and tuberculosis, and so needed a drier climate.
The farm started in 1882. My great-great-grandfather homesteaded about 4 miles north of Fort Collins. There he had some cattle, and he also farmed like he did back in Iowa. So he planted some corn. The first year the rains came and he made a pretty good crop, and he thought this is pretty good country. Well, the second and third, fourth year they did the same things, but the rains did not come, and the crops did not do well.
And then they moved to an irrigated farm so that he could raise crops, small grains that didn't take as much water.
They had Jersey milk cows, they had chickens, and the butter and the eggs were two products that they produced that they could take into town and sell.
Sugar beets were quite simply the crop that saved Colorado after the collapse of the silver economy. The legend goes that Charles Becher, who was a Leadville hardware store owner, traveled on vacation to Germany with his wife and met with German farmers who were growing sugar beets. The story goes he took one of his suitcases and emptied out all the clothes and filled it with sugar beet seed, which he brought back to Colorado.
He found out they grew very well and they produced very good sugar.
Some of the gold and silver money from the Denver area was invested in the sugar beet industry, so they did build factories. One of the first ones in northern Colorado was the Loveland factory in 1903, and then Fort Collins had a factory in 1905, so we started raising sugar beets.
The sugar beet grows a tuber root in the ground, and that's what you're after, is that root. And they would harvest the beet, pull it up and get that root and chop it up and boil it and make a molasses, and they would get the sugar crystals out of that process.
We've raised sugar beets for 100 years, and it's been the main cash crop for the farm.
And sugar became the major cash crop in Colorado between 1890 and the 1960s.
And it was a family affair. All the family members went out to harvest the sugar beets. It was all done by hand.
Labor was the biggest issue in sugar. The Great Western Sugar Plant had recruiting agencies on the Texas-Mexico border. They sent recruiters overseas to Europe to bring in laborers to work in Colorado beet fields.
At first it was the German-Russian people that migrated to America. They came and worked in the sugar beet fields. They were very industrious and they saved their money and soon owned their own farms.
The Japanese came and worked in the beet fields, and in time Mexicans came up from Central America and worked in the beet fields.
During World War II, there was a prisoner of war camp in Windsor, and the prisoners would come work in the sugar beet fields during that time. My dad had a brother that was over in England fighting in the war, so I'm sure there must have been a lot of mixed feelings with having the prisoners here.
In the 1920s, there were a lot of sheep pastured up in the high mountain meadows. They would herd those down to the railroad and ship them back east. One winter they got stuck here because the train couldn't transport them because of the blizzard. They had to figure out how to feed these sheep. They found out that the sheep loved sugar beet tops. The leaves and everything that they cut off and they just left on the ground, the sheep loved them. So the sheep industry started.
There were so many sheep fed in the Fort Collins area that it was known as the lamb feeding capital of the world.
From 1900 until the 1920s, the United States celebrated what was soon known as the Golden Age of agriculture. Prices were high, fields were green, farmers took loans from the bank to buy up more land, more seeds, more equipment. Little did they know there was a storm on the horizon.
As a farmer in Colorado, the most important thing you could do is locate your farm near water, near a stream preferably, a place where you have secure water rights.
In Colorado, an often noted fact is that 86% of the water in Colorado goes to agriculture.
Without water, there is no ranch. Without water, there is no farm.
Colorado has gone through a series of agricultural booms and busts, times of abundant rainfall and then times of drought, and times where the markets for wheat or corn were really great and times when they collapsed.
If the prices are low, produce more and then at least have more to sell, but then that drives the prices lower, and it's a very hard situation. Early years of the 20th century, those were quite prosperous years. By the 1920s, the dangers of overproduction and debt as you try to save yourself from troubles in the future and you try to buy equipment, and then there's the sudden changes in weather or prolonged periods of drought.
In good times, there's so much opportunity for farmers in Colorado. But in bad times, it's very difficult to make a living here. And in the 1930s, depression and drought drove thousands of farmers into bankruptcy. The land itself, especially on the plains, became untillable. Farmers were forced to relocate to the western slope or all the way to California in order to survive.
Eastern Colorado was hit hard by the Dust Bowl, especially the southeastern corner of the state, which would be known years later as the epicenter of the worst human-caused environmental disaster in U.S. history. Colorado's western slope, however, remained an ideal landscape for planting fruit trees.
My ancestors came to Colorado from Ankeny, Iowa in 1910. My granddad and his two brothers came here because they heard of the wonderful fruit raising area that Delta County was. They found this orchard that was already a producing orchard. They farmed for a couple years and his two brothers got disgusted and went back to Iowa. And so he decided to stay and tough it out. My granddad's name was William E. Wyrick.
The Western Slope has very different climate conditions than the high plains, and it has a different kind of soil composition as well. And the soil in the Western Slope is really well suited to fruit agriculture.
There is a good temperature extreme. Apples like cold mornings, and then they like to warm up in the afternoon. They like the cold nights. Plus, we just got good air and good water.
The Western Slope is warm and sunny, but it also is subject to periods of frost. And an early frost or a late frost could wipe out an entire crop before the trees even began to bud.
When my granddad built this house, he was a carpenter and he built the whole thing. They packed all the draft horses, pulled all the rock and gravel from the river up the hill, and they mixed the concrete and poured the basin, built the house. Everything was ready to move in, and it caught on fire from spontaneous combustion. And so they had to redo the whole basement and the floors. Otherwise, it's a great house and it's been standing there forever.
Railroads opened up the Western Slope to farming, and once the railroads arrived, you could really bring seeds from anywhere in the country.
Ice Ranch is located in Austin, Colorado. The original farm is called Wyrick Brothers Farm. Then when my dad and mom took it over in the 50s, it was Heiss Wyrick. They had apples, peaches, pears, cherries. Then, of course, they had their livestock, dairy cows and a couple workhorses, some chickens, you know, typical farm.
You can can it, you can do different forms of preservation, but the whole 20th century passion for fresh fruit and for the privilege that comes from refrigerator cars moving fruits and vegetables around, and people in wintry climates getting to have food they can preserve.
In about the early 20s, my granddad decided that they needed a way to market the fruit. So they built a packing house down in Austin. It was a big railhead then, and so they would ship the fruit here as far as Kansas City from right here in Austin. He said the only way he could ever make sure that the fruit got there in good condition was to go with it. So he'd get on the train here in Austin and go with the fruit wherever it went to make sure it got to where it was in good condition. They had a dry ice plant, and that's what they used to put in the rail cars. In those days, when they had peach trees, they had peach borers, which are worms, and they would get in the trunk of the tree and they'd kill the tree. They'd put these gunny sacks around the tree with a wire and tighten them up, and then they'd soak it with some kind of chemical or sweet or something that the worms would like. The worms would crawl in there, and then you'd have to take the burlap off and kill the worms by hand. My granddad ran this till the 50s, and then my mom and dad took this over. My dad developed a half pear, half apple. It was a delicious fruit. It would look like an apple and tasted like a pear. It was crisp like an apple, fairly juicy like an apple. They were great. To harvest the fruit, there was actually people lined up to work in those days. For example, the cherries that we used to pick, we usually picked them around July 4th. People start calling in May. When are you going to pick the cherries? We want to get on the list to pick. And we'd maybe have 75 or 100 people here to pick cherries or apples or anything. That's how a lot of people lived around here, was just manual labor.
Adaptation is something all farmers learn to expect. Change can be beneficial to farmers, bringing increased efficiency with crop patterns, irrigation, and prevention of disease. But change can also serve as a challenge.
During the 40s and the 50s, the progression of equipment and tools increased substantially. Tractors came, all sizes and shapes. Instead of taking a team of horses out and working them for half a day, stopping to give the horses a chance to rest. When the tractors came, they didn't have to rest the tractor. It just kept going.
The 1950s were a period of technological innovation, at the time where the central pivot irrigation sprinkler was invented, actually in Colorado. Of course, all of that new technology is capital intensive. It costs money. It meant that farmers had to continue growing and expanding their farms in order to make ends meet.
Technology is really something that, as an engineer, that I can really appreciate. I put GPSs on the tractors. Now I can farm really straight rows. I can take my phone and I can run all the sprinklers from my phone. Technology has made farming easier, and it's also made it possible to farm bigger expanses of land more efficiently.
We went from cutting and stacking and raking, baling about 10 acres a day to doing over 500 acres a day.
CSU was in Fort Collins doing all kinds of research. The sugar beets before the 1940s was a multi-germ seed. 6 or 7 plants would come out of one seed. Part of the process was to go through and pick out the plants until there was just one plant left. In the 1950s, they were able to get a seed that only had one germ in it to produce one plant. It took less labor to raise the plants and also helped in harvesting.
Farmers have always had an interest in coming up with ways to deter insects or other animals like deer or rabbits from eating their crops. In the 1960s and 70s, new types of chemical insecticides were being developed that made the plants more resistant to insect infestations.
And back then, people didn't think too much about the environment. And the chemicals that we used back then that were really harsh chemicals. As time has progressed, there's been a real consciousness about the fact that we are stewards of this planet and that we need to make sure that generations down, we still have a healthy environment in farming.
The estimates in the 1980s were something like 40% of Colorado farmers on the edge of bankruptcy. And that was a combination of market conditions and dropping prices and a very heavy debt load that farmers in optimism had taken on the debt.
Farming is up and down. It's kind of hard to survive on a single income.
When you have a bad year and that income isn't there, you've got to figure out how to make that up a little bit.
My mom was a teacher and she taught first grade and sixth grade. A second income was necessary, and it still is today.
My grandmother would gather eggs and she would walk into the town of Manassas and she would sell eggs, and that would bring in a little bit of extra money.
I am a professional surveyor. My surveying company has supported me to farm. Right now I grow nursery stock, and it takes 10 years to grow nursery stock, so you have to have something to kind of tide you through as you're going along.
If you want to start farming now, it's really difficult unless you have some parents or an uncle or somebody who has the land and the equipment and all to help you start farming, because it's so expensive.
In 2002, the farm economy wasn't too good, and so finally decided to sell the farm.
We were farming over 700 acres of ground and we're just barely making it. The other farmers in the area who wanted to farm were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and so land was becoming a premium.
We were able to sell it to CSU, so they own the land all around us now. And there were so many things that had been saved by the family.
And so we decided to create a farm museum.
The majority of founding of the nation were farmers, and now it's just a very small percentage.
Colorado's Centennial farms represent the ingenuity and perseverance of dedicated farmers and ranchers from generation to generation. While today's farmers face more challenges than ever before, the pride of carrying on a family's legacy ruminates through fields across Colorado.
Who will be growing the food in the future is not any question that I or anyone else can answer, but someone had better be growing the food.
This idea of starting a jerky business on the farm had been floating around the family for a decade, maybe even 2 decades. And so I made that my next career choice, to start a butcher shop and a smokehouse and to start raising pigs. But now I'm very squarely invested and imagine myself being here in some way, shape, or form probably till I die.
What I really want to do as a 6th generation farmer is enhance everything that has been given to me, because that is where we're going to get resilience in the future. I do definitely feel they need to innovate and further develop the production methods that have been given to us, because it's hard to make it work.
I was born and raised here on the ranch, and Grandpa had cows. Now we run the cows. It's always been in our blood. It's always been in our family. It's a livelihood that we were brought into, and that I will die before I leave it.
It'd be nice to keep it in the family for another 100 years. Time's ticking on, and I don't have any children of my own, but I have some nieces and nephews that would love to have it, so I'm hoping they'll take it over.
Hopefully the museum will go on and we'll be able to have the animals.
We'll always come to my dad or my aunts and uncles and ask them, what was this foundation to? Well, this was an old corral that great-grandpa Felipe used to have. It brings to mind a great question of the hard life that they lived so we could be at the point that we're at now.
We have several buildings. One of them is the 1894 house. There's 2 rooms that were built by our great Uncle Al. We also have a 1942 house. There's a milk barn. So I think it's important to preserve these things.
Where your milk comes from, where the eggs come from, is all important.
This is probably one of the only standard delicious orchard in Delta County, probably on the western slope. These apple trees here are almost, I'm sure, probably 65, 70 years old. My dad planted those when I was about 4 years old.
In farming, you get an opportunity to try something new, have a new crop, a new generation every year.
A Centennial farm, of course, is a farm that has been in one family for at least 100 years. When you think about that for even a moment, the difficulty of keeping a farm in one family over the good times and the bad in Colorado is phenomenal. These farms represent a continuity, a tradition that takes us back to our earliest roots as settlers in Colorado.
It's a wonderful deal to have this ranch, and I thank God and my family for it.
Things have sure changed quite a bit. My hope is that when I retire later on that my son will be able to take it over. My goal is that I'm not too old so that I can teach my grandchildren how to ride horses and how to rope and do all the cowboy stuff that I enjoy.
We still try to carry on that legacy. You know, we still do cattle drives by horseback. We still do camping out under the stars. We try to relive that lifestyle as much as possible, just to keep it fresh in our memories and know that what we have couldn't have existed if it wasn't for them.
I very much enjoy being here with my children, my nieces, my nephews, and then my grandchildren. I have a little grandson, Andrew, who loves to spend the summers here with me, and he's going to be a farmer like his papoy.